Okay, let us start. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the session of Decarbonizing the Building Sector. I am Shoran Chatterjee. I work at the Central European University as a postdoctoral fellow, and I would like to welcome all of you for your interest and also thank you for joining us for this conversation. So first, as we know that building sector is for people actually. So it would be great if you can turn on your camera because we would like to have it as interactive session as it is possible. And turning on camera goes to the audience as well, if it is okay with you. And as we also know that this session is actually getting recorded, and it will be probably posted in the YouTube as well. So if you feel uncomfortable seeing yourself in the YouTube, then please feel free to switching off your camera, but otherwise, please switch it on. We would love to interact with you directly. For few housekeeping rule is that as we know that please mute yourself, you are not talking. If you have any question, then only unmute yourself. For the question answer for each of the presentation, after each of the presentation, we will have a 5 minutes Q&A. And there you can ask your question. In case there are too many hands for the particular presentation, we will ask you to write your question on the chat box and our speakers can respond to that. And lastly, what I would like to tell you that I think Vasilis will take some pictures, if that is okay, for the Sentinel Twitter and EMP Twitter. So, he may tell you when to switch on, if it is okay for you. So with that, I would like to introduce this amazing panel. So I will start with my friend and colleague, Vasilis. Over to you, Vasilis.
Yes, thanks, Ran. Hello, everyone. I'm Vasilis Stavrakas. I'm working in the Techno-Economics of Energy Systems Laboratory in the University of Piraeus Research Center in Greece. My main field of expertise is energy systems modeling with specialty in demand-side management and demand-side modeling in general. Very happy to be here with you today. And I'm not presenting, I'm co-chairing with Suran from slightly retrofitted residential building. So let's have a very interesting discussion. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Vasilis. Let us go to Alessio. Alessio, please briefly introduce yourself.
Thanks a lot, Suran. My name is Alessio Mastrucci from IASA. I'm a research scholar in the Energy, Climate and Environment program here at IASA in Vienna. And today we'll be presenting from home. So it's my home in Vienna, and this is a partly renovated building. We just got triple glazing windows last year.
Thank you, Alessio. Can we go to Tim then? Tim? Okay, Tarun?
Hi, I'm Tarun Khanna. I'm joining in from the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. It's a lovely renovated block in the center of the city.
Super, thank you, Tarun. Can we go to Carlos?
Okay, so my name is Carlos Quezada. I'm presenting from University of Deusto in the city of Bilbao in Spain. And today I'm in a 5-story university building, in particular the Faculty of Engineering.
Super, thank you, Carlos. Tim, can we come back to you? Can you hear us, Tim? Okay, it seems Tim cannot hear us. All right, so I think I can tell you about Tim a bit. So Tim works at ISI Farmhof. I don't know how to pronounce correctly, but Farmhofer, ISI of Germany. And he's, okay, Tim is now, we can hear you.
Apologies, my Bluetooth speakers just ran out of battery. I'm hoping that it will work out. Do you guys hear me now? Does that work?
Yes, perfectly. We can hear you.
Perfect. Thanks a lot already for the introduction, Shudan. As you said, my name is Tim Mandel. I'm a researcher at Fraunhofer ISI. My work focuses on energy efficiency policy and energy systems modeling with a particular focus on the building sector. Very happy to be here. Sorry.
Sure. Thank you so much. And as I mentioned that I am Shoran Chatterjee, I will be chairing this session. And right now I will be presenting from a LED Plus building, office building that is at CU Budapest. So let me first share my screen to tell you that why we are here. In other words, that why we need to actually study building sector at all, or why do we care about building sector? As we know that buildings are responsible around 40% of the EU energy consumption and 36% of the greenhouse gas emission. That makes the building sector single largest consumer in Europe. However, the problem gets much more critical because majority of the EU building stock are considered to be energy inefficient. Why? Because many of the building stocks are more than 50 years old and hence their energy performances are not very optimal, let's say. So one way around could have been to have a high renovation rate. And that means that we renovate all these old energy inefficient buildings and make them energy efficient. However, the present renovation rate in the EU is around 1%. And as we can understand that with this renovation rate, it is actually not possible to achieve a significant energy reduction of the building from the building sector. And hence, what we need to understand that with not achieving a significant reduction from the building sector, it would be difficult to achieve the climate neutrality goal set by EU, which is achieving climate neutrality by 2050. Therefore, it is really important for us to understand how we can reduce the energy consumption and energy demand of the building sector. And therefore, at the Central European University, we have developed a model called high efficiency building model, through which we see that under different renovation rate and presence of different advanced buildings, such as passive houses and net zero buildings, how the energy demand profile of the building sector look like in the future. So as I mentioned, this is our HIB model or high efficiency building model. And the key philosophy of this model is basically it considers building as a complete system rather than sum of components. And furthermore, it also includes state-of-art buildings such as passive houses or net zero buildings. Now, HIB model uses a bottom-up approach. And for that, we take a very detailed classification of the building stock. How detailed? For example, for region, we have actually a global coverage, but since we received funding from European Commission Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program for the Sentinel project, we are here, I'm going to present only the EU level results. But for EU level as well, we have detailed classification. For example, we can produce data for each of the member states along with UK. Now, next, for each of the member states, we also have detailed climate classification and urbanization. That means whether the building is located in the urban sector or rural sector, and also different type of buildings such as residential, commercial, and public. There is slum as well, or in literature, it is often referred as informal settlement, but for EU, it doesn't, it do not have a huge share of it. For residential sector, however, we disaggregated further to single family and multifamily household. And for commercial sector, we had different type of commercial buildings such as educational, hotel, restaurant, hospital, and so on. And lastly, based on the energy performance of the building, we segregated further to 5 different building vintages, precisely standard, the existing building, new building, retrofitted building, advanced new, such as passive house or net zero buildings, and advanced retrofitted buildings. So you can understand these are very detailed classification of the building stock. And we do that for each of the member states as well as the EU, of course. Now, with this detailed classification of buildings, I have developed we have developed four scenarios, and this model is actually developed back in 2012. But now, since last year, we have updated it further under Sentinel project. So first is deep efficiency scenario, where we have assumed that a renovation rate of 3%, annual 3% renovation rate with the new construction after 2027 will be made only at advanced level, that is either net zero level or passive house level. Next, we have towards net zero scenario, This is very similar assumption with deep efficiency scenario. Only in this scenario, we consider the potential of the on-site energy production from the building as well. Third, we have the moderate efficiency scenario, which basically incorporates the present EPBD directives and building codes for the new buildings. And this basically tells us that how the present efficiency level looks like. Lastly, we have frozen efficiency scenario, which tells us if we do not even adhere to the present efficiency standard and codes, then what will happen to our energy demand. So the purpose of these 4 scenarios are not to predict the future, but rather to give a what-if insight into consequences of certain decision. Now, with the detailed building classification and 4 scenarios, now let us go into the results of our modeling exercise. And as we know that energy demand primarily depends on the floor area. And thus, we will start with the floor area results. So this is presented at EU level. And here we can see that as per our results, the EU floor area is expected to grow by 16% by 2050. And this growth is majorly led by the growth in tertiary building sector. However, the residential building sector is also expected to experience a growth in floor area as well, but the growth is not as high as tertiary building sector. Now, the challenge is particularly very difficult because now with the increasing floor area growth, is the EU building sector will be able to achieve a significant energy reduction? The answer to this question is yes, it can. So here on my left-hand side of the diagram, you can see that under 2 of our scenarios, precisely towards net zero scenario and deep efficiency scenario, building sector can achieve a significant amount of energy reduction. The energy reduction can actually ranges between 35% to 75% under deep efficiency scenario, and under net zero scenario, it ranges between 64 to 86%. So you can see that how significant this energy reduction can be. And this energy reduction is coming from mostly 3 end uses, precisely space heating, space cooling, and hot water demand. And on my right-hand side, that's why I have presented this graph on the deep efficiency scenario, where we can see that how significantly the energy consumption is getting reduced over 2060 for these 3 particular end uses. Now, moving on, as we know that EU is basically consisting different member states, hence it is really important for us to understand how each of the member states are performing. And that is why I present here the results for each of the member states. And here also you can see that each of the member states follows the similar trends like EU. However, what we can see that key energy consumer in EU are Germany, France, Italy, Poland, and of course, UK. So we need to understand whether these key energy consumers are being able to achieve a significant amount of energy reduction by 2050. And the answer to this question is, again, they can. So if they follow a 3% renovation rate along with advanced building construction after 2027, then all these member states as well as EU can achieve a significant number of energy demand. So this is something you can see from our diagram. Now, what we need to understand that one of the key goals in EU climate neutrality is that we need to use more renewable energy, right? That means, in other words, we need to replace the fossil fuel-based energy sources with renewable energy sources. But in order to do that, what we need to understand is how the hourly energy demand profile will look like. So this is basically the future hourly energy demand profile. And here you can see where the heating demand is particularly getting high during the winter season, and the cooling demand exists only during the summer season, and hot water demand maintain their peak during both winter season, but in the summer season, actually, the hot water demand gets decreased a bit compared to the winter season. On the right-hand side, here you can see that I have presented a particular day hourly profile for 2 particular days, one from summer, one from winter, One is on 11th August, another is from 11th January. And with this hourly profile, it will be now our next step. And this is something what we are doing next is to see whether the on-site energy production from the building sector can cover the energy demand, can cover the hourly energy demand. So this is our next step, and hence to conclude, so basically, as we can see that to limit the global temperature by 1.5 degree, climate neutrality is important. And to achieve climate neutrality, we need to accelerate the renovation rate as high as possible, at least up to 3%. If we go with moderate scenario, that means the existing policies and efficiency standard, then the energy saving potential would not be that high. However, if we do not even comply with the moderate scenario, that is existing policy, the energy demand is expected to grow. And that is why the best idea would be to increase the renovation rate as well as renovate the existing and historical buildings in developed nations such as EU. So with this, I would like to thank you. And if you have any question, I would like to answer. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Suran, for this very interesting presentation. We have two questions actually in the chat, so maybe we can take those now.
Sure.
So the first one is from Jean-Sebastian Brock, and it's an interesting one actually. It says that most of the demand increase seems to occur after 2030, even in the deep efficiency scenario. So does that mean that there is no way the energy demand in the building sector significantly decreasing now, between now and 2030?
Thank you so much, Sebastian, for this amazing question. In our modeling approach, what we did, we assumed that the present renovation rate would still go on till 2027. And the new building construction which are happening, they will be at advanced level only after 2027. We took this bit conservative approach, seeing the present, very low present renovation rate, and also seeing that not all the new construction presently are built at an advanced level, and hence we took this advanced level, conservative approach. And that is why you can see that by 2030 the energy savings is not significant even in the deep efficiency scenario. I hope that answers your question. Next, I see a question from Peter Beryl. What is the energy modeling simulation tool used to calculate the hourly energy demand? It is Energy Plus. No, it is again our model that is high efficiency building model, where we actually calculate even heating degree days, cooling degree days. And with that help of that, we actually calculate the hourly profile from the total energy demand. So I see a question from Tarun. What is the assumed reduction in energy consumption of building after it has been renovated? That's a good question, Tarun. It depends from member states to member states, but in EU, it is around 30%, but it depends what type of renovation you are going forward. If it is shallow retrofitted, it would not achieve probably 30%, but if it is a deep renovation, it would go up as high as 90%. So that's why even our renovation, you will see that we have categorized into retrofitted building as well as advanced retrofitted buildings. In advanced retrofitted building, it would be considered around 90%, but in shallow retrofitted, it would be around 30%.
On an average or all your modeling, it's around 30%.
Yeah, around. So I guess if we do not have any more question, we can directly go to the next presenter, which is Alessio. Great. I think we do not have any more questions. So
we have one last. We have one last actually. Sorry, Suran. Matteo Berzanti, sorry if I misspell, asks if are these results already available in a publication?
So I mean, it is accepted already, but I think it is. It will be published either end of December or early January. So first as a book form, then some article form as well. Thank you, Matteo, for your interest. Alessio, so let's move on to next question. If there are any more questions, please feel free to write. I'm happy to answer over chat. Over to you, Alessio.
Thank you very much, Suran. I will start now sharing my screen. Hope you can see my presentation now.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks a lot, Suran. Great introduction. And I think my presentation goes very well along the line of your presentation. So yes, I'm Alessio Mastrucci, working at YASA, and together with my colleagues Benigna Bozakis and Basman Raivan, we have been working in the last months on this policy scenario study towards carbon neutrality. And also in my case, we have like a global focus, but also in this presentation, I will focus mostly on Europe and on the residential sector. So going now into the motivation. So a lot has been already said by Suran, so I will be quite quick here. So yeah, buildings are key in achieving climate change mitigation, and they play a key role also in carbon neutrality. So the EU has set ambitious targets to get to carbon neutrality by 2050, and buildings is a key sector in there, especially yes for renovation due to the issue of old inefficient buildings. And modeling can provide a valuable tool to understand possible evolution of the building sector and its energy demand and emissions, and therefore provide support to decisions on climate mitigation and sustainability strategies. However, yes, there are some gaps in modeling, and on one end we have integrated assessment modeling, which have been focusing traditionally on the supply side at global level. And now there is a process in improving the representation also of end-use sectors in those. On the other hand, there are also building stock models, often at regional or national scale, which go more into detail. But the gap is in kind of bridging these different scales and providing, the right level of detail, and also the description of heterogeneity in the building sector, where we have, a complexity due to different building types, different actors with different interests, which needs to be captured to some degree to better understand the future dynamics towards energy and emission reductions. So the objective of our work is to try and bridge this gap by providing a framework, a modeling framework, combining bottom-up building stock modeling and integrated assessment. So we have a soft linkage with an integrated assessment model. And our goal was really to improve the representation of this heterogeneity in different buildings, different households, and associated dynamics. And specifically for this presentation, I will focus on residential space heating and pathways towards carbon neutrality in Europe under different policy scenarios. So here we wanted also to investigate a broader range of policies encompassing also the demand side and supply side, but also as many scenarios are focusing on energy efficiency improvements, we also wanted to add some insights on activity and structural changes in the residential sector, which we can investigate with our modeling framework. So I will now briefly introduce the framework. So this framework has just been very recently published in Climatic Change, and yes, it's basically composed of different modules, which all go under the name of this Message IX building. So we basically started from collecting data and also working on the global level. The challenge is often to find data, so we relied a lot on statistics, but also on country level survey data were available, so to improve as much as possible the level of detail in describing the building stock. Then we built some projections for floor space, building types for the future, for different scenarios. And here comes the energy demand model. So we have a space heating and cooling demand model that we run over a spatial grid. And this is based on a variable degree days approach, which improves the standard degree day approach, but by also considering the characteristics of buildings and operation of buildings in the calculation. Then we have the building stock turnover model, which includes a material flow analysis model to calculate the turnover of buildings, new construction, demolitions, and a set of discrete choice model, which describe the decision of households on renovation and new construction. And here we also get from the integrated assessment model message AX Globium price signals, which are also considered in the decisions for energy efficiency in renovation and new construction. And finally, we aggregate and report all the results at the stock level, and we report floor space, energy demand, and CO2 emissions. When it comes to the model implementation, so here we, at the global level, we have 60 global regions, but we also have for Europe a country level representation. So in this presentation, I will be reporting results for the level of entire Europe, which is actually a bit broader than the EU and includes also all countries in the Western and Eastern European region in message. So it includes, for instance, also the Balkans and Turkey. And what we were really aiming for was to improve this representation of heterogeneity. So similar to what Suran showed, we have a series of dimensions where we try to differentiate inputs for buildings, including different climatic zones, different location, meaning urban and rural, different household income classes, housing types, and heating fuels. In this presentation, I will focus mostly on different energy efficiency cohorts for buildings. So here also we differentiate between different vintages of buildings, different periods of construction, which also correspond to different energy efficiency level. Then existing renovated buildings, also standard and advanced type, similar to what Suran has shown, and similar new construction buildings. Then here, our basic assumption for the scenarios is SSP2 baseline. And we also run a calibration concerning the historic housing stock, floor space, and energy demand to make sure the results in the base year are consistent with what is observed. And we use results from message AX Globium scenarios to get energy price signals and emission factors. So very briefly, an introduction on the framework for the scenario study. This is ongoing work, so these are just preliminary results, so they are not meant to be comprehensive, but our idea was to explore different types of policies. And on one end, we stick for the kind of more sectoral policies to the avoid, shift, improve framework, which is very common in the transport sector and now is more also commonly used in other sectors as well. And this framework is dividing different shifts or policies into these three different components. So the avoid component, which also, so the A component, which also stands for avoid or activity, focuses on the activity level of buildings. And here we focus on two key actions. So one is the reduction of the heated floor space. And the second one is the reduction of heating set point. The second component is the S, so the shift or structural component, and this refers to structural changes in the buildings. And here we refer on one end on the structural changes in the building fabric. So for instance, switching from single family to multifamily homes in the future, and also shifting the structure of energy carriers or heating fuels. For instance, here we show the effect of shifting to electricity in new construction and renovation. And finally, the improve component, which also corresponds to intensity or energy intensity. Here we have actions which refer to the energy efficiency improvements of building shells, such as building codes for new construction and subsidies for renovation. Then we have a second layer, which comes from, which describes more the supply side. And here we compare two different scenarios, one baseline with no stringent climate policies, and a second one with the stringent climate policies according to the 1.5 degree targets. And here we get different price signals and emission factors from the message IM. I will quickly go through a set of results, starting from results by housing cohorts. And also I will start from the floor space. So here I'm showing in the first column the results for the base year 2015, where we just have existing buildings in red belonging to different periods of construction. And then the second and the third column represents the composition of the housing stock in 2050 in the PIU scenario and the climate policy scenario. And here we see that a consistent fraction of the existing building stock has been either renovated or replaced by new buildings, so respectively in yellow and in green. And we also see that the floor space has been growing over time. Then if we show results for the different ASI type of policies, so the avoid, shift, improved, and then the combined three strategies together, we can see that there are differences both in the absolute amount of floor space, which is reduced in the case of shifting to more multifamily homes, as well as in the case of reduction of floor space per capita. And the I component, so the intensity component, also entails increased renovation rate compared to what we observed in the baseline. We also observed, so in the third group of results, this is applying the climate policies, and for what concerned the building stock composition, there are no major changes compared to the other case. Now, on the right side, I'm showing the results in terms of final energy for space heating. And here we can see this reduction in final energy already in the BAU scenario, and the effect of different kind of policies. What we can observe is that here, the new construction and renovated buildings, of course, because of their higher energy efficiency, they have quite a lower contribution to the energy demand than to the floor space. And also we can see that the combination of different ASI strategies entails the major reduction in energy demand due to their synergy, the complementarities of these different strategies. Now moving on to the results by different heating fuels. So I'm showing similar results, and here we can also observe progress shifting from fossil fuels towards electricity. And here, this shift is triggered even more by the climate policy scenario due to the increased price of fuels, especially fossil fuels. And now when we observe also the effect of the different ASI components, we can observe that this electrification effect is especially driven by the shift. So the S component due to the shift to electricity in new construction and renovation, and also in the combined scenarios, climate policy and ASI. So now also observing now the final energy results, here again we see that the electricity has quite lower contribution to the final energy than its proportional share in the building stock, and this is due also to the fact that there is an uptake of heat pumps over time, which have higher efficiency. And we can also see that this shift to electricity is even more pronounced in the climate policy kind of scenarios. Now looking into some emission results to conclude. Here we have different emission factors for the different energy system scenarios. And we can observe that for electricity, there is a drop in emission factors in the climate policy scenario due to the uptake of negative emission technologies. And this is reflected also in the results. So whereas for the energy demand, we observed similar levels between the DIU and climate policy scenarios, here we can observe that in the BIU scenarios, there is still a presence of both direct and indirect emissions, whereas in the climate policy, the indirect emissions attributed to district heating and electricity are minimized due to the decarbonization of the supply system, while there is still a residual amount of direct emission, which is mainly due to fossil fuels and especially natural gas. Right, so to conclude the presentation, this is just a set of illustrative policies. Of course, we want to investigate even more policies, especially on renovation, like doubling the renovation rate as it is recommended in the Green Deal strategy, as well as renewable. But we can already observe that combining different avoid, shift, improve components is a very effective strategy to reduce energy demand. And we observed a reduction up to almost 80% by 2050. And using also these strategies has a number of benefits, as it also can improve the thermal comfort in buildings, and therefore reduce also issues with energy poverty, as well as triggering employment effects through renovation. And also compared to the decarbonization of the supply system using negative emission, this also relies on proven technologies. But of course, when we observe the combination of these sectoral ASI policies combined with climate policy, we can observe major CO2 emission due to the decarbonization of the energy system. Finally, more on the modeling side and the impact of the studies, and we can we demonstrated the use of combined integrated assessment and building sectoral model, and this allowed us to improve the representation of the building stock, the granularity and heterogeneity in the building stock and in its dynamics, and account for a broader range of policies, including also structural changes and activity changes, as well as supply side kind of policies. But of course, this comes with challenges, because the first one is, of course, the data availability. So these are very data intensive models. So we try our best to collect data, but there is still, I think, a lot to do to cover gaps in data. And the second challenge is also about model calibration. We started this process, but of course, making sure the dynamics represent kind of real world changes is also challenging, and we are trying to collect additional data to further calibrate the model. And our next steps would be to also start a linkage this framework to different models. We are working on materials and combining also agent-based model. We have another presentation tomorrow with Leila and Amir on combining this framework with the agent-based modeling for renovation decisions, and explore additional climate impacts, socioeconomic and policy scenarios. Yes, and I think this was all I wanted to share with you, and I'm looking forward now to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alessio. It's really insightful presentation. However, we see that we are running a bit over time. So may I kindly request you, there are some very, very interesting questions over the chat. If you can kindly have a look at them and answer them, that would be great. And I think one of the two questions are really big question, which we would also like to discuss after the session, but it would be great if you can have a look at the chat. So now let us move directly to Tim. Over to you, Tim.
Yes, thank you. Let me just share my screen real quick.
And may I also kindly request to limit your presentation within 12 minutes max, so that we can have a quick Q&A. Thanks.
I'll see what I can do. Okay, you should be able to see my screen now, I hope.
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Then thanks a lot. You can see the title. So the topic that I would like to present today is about energy efficiency first in the European building sector, investigating least cost pathways for net zero emissions. This is my structure for the presentation. I would like to begin with giving a little bit of background on what exactly does energy efficiency first mean. I'll then continue with the objective of our model-based assessment, which is to investigate these least cost pathways for net zero emissions in the EU building sector. I will briefly present our methodology in terms of scenarios and energy models. I will then go on to present some, I must emphasize, preliminary results of this analysis. Unfortunately, we're right in the middle of the final data analysis, but still there are some early insights that I would like to share with you. And finally, I will conclude with some general outlooks on the ENA-FIRST project in which these activities are nested in. To begin with, what exactly does energy efficiency first mean? So at its core, the energy efficiency first principle, which has popped up in recent years in EU legislation, is about solving the trade-off between what is referred to as demand and supply side resources in society's best interest. So on the one hand, we have supply side resources. In order to reach net zero emissions, we of course need renewable generators, we need networks, we need utility scales, storage facilities, and much more. However, the key proposition of energy efficiency first is that these supply side assets can potentially be replaced by what is called demand side resources. So these can be end-use and energy efficiency options, particularly in the building sector. We talk about demand response. There's the topic of energy service sufficiency, and finally, distributed energy resources. And in a nutshell, what energy efficiency first says is that demand side resources should be prioritized whenever these are more cost efficient or valuable from a societal perspective in meeting decision objectives such as net zero emissions by 2050, than alternative supply side resources. The objective of our model-based assessment is as follows. So with a particular focus on the building sector, in NF first, we are investigating the societal value of end-use energy efficiency and demand response at 2 levels of analysis. Today, I would like to focus on what is labeled here as level 1, or the energy system analysis for the EU27. Here we are investigating basically what level of end-use energy efficiency in residential and non-residential buildings should be pursued for the EU building sector to provide the greatest societal value in transitioning to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. You may already have stumbled across the term societal value. This is something that I will come back to for sure, because it has some details that are worth mentioning. But to continue first a bit on our methodology and our scenarios that we're investigating. Our scenario storylines itself are relatively straightforward. So we have a range of 3 scenarios, which vary by the extent of end-use energy efficiency in the building sector. The rationale behind this is as follows. If we were to go for what is labeled here as the low efficiency scenario, that means in turn, in order to reach net zero emissions, we need large capacities for power generation, for heat pumps eventually, for district heating. We need networks, we need storage facilities, and much more. I should have mentioned a second ago that all of these 3 scenarios are geared to reach net zero emissions. So all of these are normative scenarios instead of, contrary to the previous presentations, exploratory scenarios. This is the big difference. In turn, when looking at the high efficiency scenario, which is characterized by very high ambition levels for building renovation, but also for electrical appliances and lighting. This allows us to pinpoint the effect of energy efficiency measures on energy system costs and related indicators. We investigate these 3 scenarios with a range of 4 soft-coupled energy models. These are forecast, invert, Anatile, and net heat. And basically, if we were to focus now on this indicator of system costs, the key point here is that each of these models contributes individual cost items in order to come up with this final figure of energy system costs. Energy system costs are our proxy to get close to something that resembles societal value. From an economic perspective, you would start off with concepts such as social welfare, or you would need to define a social welfare function or something related to that. Our limited scope on this concept is this notion of energy system costs. So it's basically composed of all capital expenditures and capital costs, if you will, as well as all sorts of operating expenses that occur until 2050. In the discussion, I will briefly come back to the limitations of this viewpoint and the other contributions that we are making in the NFS project on this matter. Let me present some early results. What you see here is final energy demand in the building sector across the 3 scenarios from now until 2050 in different variations. On the left-hand side, you see final energy demand by end use. On the right-hand side at the top, we've got the same figure basically for heating and cooling, and at the bottom for appliances and lighting. To begin with, let me emphasize some numbers here on the left-hand side. What we can nicely see here is if we compare 2050 and 2090, is that across all scenarios, despite the first one being labeled low efficiency, we still need very substantial reductions in final energy demand in order to comply with net zero emissions by 2050. However, if we consider the differences between, let's say, the high efficiency and the low efficiency scenario, we still see great potentials for energy savings in the building sector, which is here about 670 terawatt hours, or an additional 24% to what is already achieved in the low efficiency scenario. If I may get your attention here on the right hand side on final energy demand for heating and cooling, we can see that there are some obvious potentials for renewable based heating and cooling in buildings. That means for solar and biomass. And what's interesting to see is that if we look at this bluish block right here, which represents heat pumps, we see that the demand for heat pumps can be substantially different by 2050, which is, if I see that correctly, in like a difference of about 200 terawatt hours or so. And the key point here is that this has large implications for the cost of electricity supply in this case, when it comes to renewable-based generation, when it comes to distribution and transmission networks, and finally for storage and all sorts of flexibility options. The bottom figure maybe is less interesting. There's not much going on as for appliances and lighting, because many potentials are already exploited, and some of the savings are counteracted with behavioral changes across the scenarios. That's why the effects are a little bit modest here. But let me continue with the maybe final figure of our analysis. And big disclaimer at the very beginning: there are many data items still missing in this figure, but still gives you an idea what is coming up next in this analysis. This is basically an analysis of the cumulative differential costs between the high efficiency scenario at the right hand side and the low efficiency scenario on the left hand side. So what we did is to add up all capital costs by 2050 and all operating expenses. We're not discounting the payment date, let's say, but capital costs are discounted at a 2% discount rate. What we can see, and what is maybe an interesting finding in itself, is that despite these huge differences in final energy demand between the scenarios by 2050, we don't see much difference in terms of the cost for individual heating systems. This is because these heating systems are characterized by a large fixed cost component. So overall, it doesn't make a big difference in terms of cost, whether we install, let's say, 10 gigawatts of heat pump capacity or 9.5 gigawatts or so. It won't save us that much in monetary expenses in the long run. In turn, we need large investments for building renovation. The same goes for electrical appliances and lighting equipment. I must emphasize again, these are very preliminary numbers, but what we will probably see in the end of this analysis is that these initial expenses or expenditures for building renovation and electrical appliances will be counteracted on the one hand by fuel savings, and then also to a limited extent with lesser costs for electricity network expansion, gas wholesale, which is still missing here. We still need the numbers for electricity, dedicated electricity generation, much more. But this is the general image we're trying to convey in this analysis, and we're hoping for some very interesting results once we have the final data up and running. To conclude, let me just briefly show a couple of discussion points that we continue to encounter in the project. This is my last slide. First of all, I mentioned the societal perspective before, which is quite controversial. And the key question is, how do we make sure that the analysis takes a consistent societal perspective throughout? For example, how do you get rid of all transfer payments like taxes and subsidies, which ideally would need to be deducted from a societal perspective? This can be pretty easy for something like an energy efficient refrigerator, where you deduct value added tax, but it's much more complicated for composite investments like building renovations, most notably, where there's a share of labor costs and labor taxes that will need to be deduced, but which are very hard to determine. A related question is, what about the multiple impacts, like reduced air pollution, macroeconomic effects, etc.? Which of these ideally would need to be considered from a societal perspective, and which ones not? Second point I would like to highlight is our scope of demand-side resources. We're mostly focusing on end-use energy efficiency, but the question remains about the dedicated effect of demand response as a demand-side resource on system costs, and the same goes for energy service sufficiency. And finally, we have this, we did not get past this ongoing controversy about rebound effects. Our models do reflect direct rebound effects, but questions remain as to indirect and macroeconomic rebound effects. So this adds some uncertainty to our data, and it may counteract actually the energy savings that we are calculating there. This leads me to the end of my presentation. I would like to briefly highlight our activities in our first project. We are investigating in this project the conceptual background to efficiency first. We're modeling its effects across the EU energy system. And finally, we're developing policy guidelines for its implementation in different policy areas. Apologies for the overtime. I'm very happy to take questions now. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tim, for this amazing presentation. I'm sure we will have some questions. So from the audience, if you have any question, please raise your hand and we can directly come to you. Do you have any question? Please raise your hand by using the reaction button in Zoom.
I may have spoken a little bit fast. But
oh, that's okay.
Feel free to ask me anything.
So, Tim, maybe I have one question for you. So, in terms of, energy efficiency first principle, we often talk about energy efficiency policies, especially for the building sector, but we often do not consider the inclusivity of it. That means whether these policies are whether inclusive of people or not. And hence, we often see that these policies become very technical and the implementation rate become, it do not, let's say, achieve its intended purpose. So how do you see and how do you model this, if you can, the inclusivity of this policy?
Well, in general, I must say that policy modeling is not explicitly considered in this analysis because it's mostly, from a mathematical perspective, it's an optimization problem. And basically what we do is to, in these three scenarios, to assume minimum requirements for end-use energy efficiency measures in buildings. Of course, in reality, things are much more nuanced. So you cannot just put standards on everything, but you need dedicated measures to drive economic actors to move towards net zero, basically. And this is actually a big question that we're trying to get our head around in the NF1 project, because what energy efficiency policy has been doing for decades is to rely on standards, finance, and information, and which arguably has had some limited effect by now. And in NF1, we're looking at some dedicated policies to truly put efficiency first into practice. And this includes, for example, the topic how funding is provided to large-scale projects. If funding to a power transmission line is provided, then we argue that a check should be made before, if it's not more cost-effective for the company or even for society to deploy end-use energy efficiency measures and other demand-side resources. So this is only one example of policy measures for efficiency first, but there's a lot more that we're currently investigating.
Sure. Thank you so much, Tim. So let us now move to the next presentation then. If you have more questions, feel free to write in your chat box and feel free to address it to Tim so we know it's for him. Now, can we directly go to Tarun, please?
Great. Let's just share my screen.
Yep. Tim, could you please stop sharing your screen? No, thanks. You did.
Okay, great. Thanks and welcome, everyone. I'll be presenting a recent work which I have done with co-authors at MCC Berlin on the role of behavioral change in reducing household energy consumption and CO2 emissions in residential buildings. The paper, if you wish to read it, is available in the latest issue of Nature Energy. Actually, I don't really need to set the stage for this presentation much, because I think Tim's presentation really sets it down, given what we just saw, were that in every efficiency scenario that you can envisage in the next few years, building energy demand just has to come down. So I think that's a good, excellent point to think from when you're looking at, and they've already highlighted the importance of demand side response. But in this paper, we sort of didn't really look at demand side response, but we looked at overall reduction in consumption of buildings due to various demand-side behavior interventions. Now, there's a very rich literature in both behavioral economics and psychology, and increasingly also in the engineering sciences, on how to prompt households for achieving energy conservation at home. However, what was missing was from the literature was a comprehensive synthesis and understanding of what this is in terms of the carbon emissions, which is exactly what we try to do in this study. So just to highlight, we focus on daily use behaviors in households and interventions, both price and non-price interventions that try and reduce energy consumption of households. So this would include things like time of use pricing, information, so things like home audits, but also social comparisons and norms through home energy reports, very sort of established literature in experimental economics and psychology, but also increasingly new literature which comes from things like using motivation devices like mobile games, for example, where you try and get households to compete with each other on saving the most energy. So it's a relatively broad spectrum of behavioral interventions, and which all target towards overall energy reduction.
Tarun, sorry to intervene. It seems that your voice is somehow breaking and it is getting difficult to hear.
Okay, is it better now?
Yes, it's better. It's
okay.
Better.
I'll just hold the
Thanks.
earphones then in my hand, which is funny, but go ahead. Okay, so we don't specifically look at building weatherization and replacement. So I guess it's, in some sense, this review is a bit of a complement to everything that has been presented so far, but I'll get back to this in the end. So our key questions were quite simple, really. So by how much can monetary incentives and non-monetary interventions reduce energy consumption of households in energy buildings? So we were looking at average treatment effects of interventions. Which interventions are most effective and under what conditions? So what accounts for the heterogeneity in treatment effect across studies? And by how much can CO2 emissions be reduced using such interventions? I should mention here that we looked at, let me skip to the next slide now. So how do we do this? We look at do a systematic review and meta-analysis of the literature. We include all studies which implement one or more of these behavioral interventions in an experimental setting. So it either a field trial or a quasi-experimental setting, but at least in some sort of behavioral setting. And overall, we use a machine learning assisted algorithm to search and screen literature. So we look at overall about 60,000 articles, which we then used we then screened using a machine learning algorithm, and eventually then read about 1,000 papers, and finally included about 122, which are included in our meta-analysis. These were manually coded by a team of researchers. Overall, the sample of evidence that we have represents experiments done on around 1.1 billion households in about 25 countries. Okay, so what do we find? Well, let me first just quickly explain the dependent variable in our analysis. So this is in order to standardize the effect across interventions and specification types that people use in different studies, we converted all the resulting estimates from different studies into something that's called Fisher's C or Fisher's Z. which indicates the strength of correlation between energy reductions and interventions. Now, just to give a sort of sense of what Fisher's Z or Z can look like, so all of the behavior literature in psychology has a combined Fisher's Z of something like 0.20. All of the literature that looks at effectiveness of non-steroidal pain medication on how effective it is in reducing pain has a Fisher's Z of about 0.14. So given that context, what do we find about interventions that we look at? So it depends a little bit on the model that you choose. But the average treatment effect across models is significant and varies somewhere between 0.01 and 0.14, which indicates that there is a small but to medium but significant effect of these interventions on household energy consumption, which is significant enough in medium samples, but when you scale up populations, it can definitely lead to significant effects as well. There is a high level of heterogeneity in the aggregate effect sizes. So depending upon where the experiment is done, etc., depending on the study that we pick up, there is a high degree of heterogeneity, which we investigate as well. But we also rank the different interventions in terms of their effectiveness, and we do find that the average effect for monetary incentives for the sort of sizes of incentives studied in the literature are substantially higher than some of the behavioral experiments like social comparison or motivation techniques. We also find that there are significant complementarities between some interventions. So for example, certain packages of interventions, one that definitely stands out. So combining feedback, social comparison, and monetary incentives works really, really well. So the combined effect is about 0.35 and is higher than the average effect size of each of these interventions individually. It is a bit lower than the sum of the average effect of these three interventions. So there is not sort of a complete linear addition of the effect sizes, but there are still positive gains to be had in combining the right kind of interventions. There are intervention packages that don't seem to work particularly better than the others. So combining feedback and social comparison is very popular in the literature. We find that it doesn't necessarily improve the overall effectiveness of these interventions. However, we don't. There is some work in the literature which tries to understand why some packages work better than the others, but we feel that a lot more can be done to understand this particular aspect as well. Lastly, what does all this mean in terms of emissions reduction? So if you don't use Fisher's Z, but we use a rather cruder measure of the outcome, so percentage change or percentage reduction in energy consumption, we find that overall all the interventions combined give an average reduction of about 5 to 6%. So that's the sort of average across the studies that we look at, and just scaling that up to the cumulative emissions of residential buildings right now, we estimate that there is an immediate sort of potential or a short to medium term potential of about 350 megatons of CO2 reductions using these sort of monetary and non-monetary interventions. Of course, much can be done to refine these estimates in terms of which combinations of interventions you apply, where do you apply them, and whether these sort of marginal reductions in energy demand are actually sometimes can be much more useful than in reducing, for example, coal use. There is, we do not, however, look at, as I mentioned, building intervention, renovations, and that could potentially have a slightly higher impact. what explains the heterogeneity in our results? Unsurprisingly, regions matter. So studies from Asia, which includes China and Japan specifically, tend to report higher effect sizes, especially for monetary incentives. Also from Europe reports slightly higher effect sizes, but the difference is not statistically significant. An important thing that we find is that studies which have a very long-term duration actually tend to find really weak effects, but there are not so many studies which are done over the long term. So like we really do need studies that go on for 2-3 years to understand the medium to long-term potential of these interventions. And there is definitely a need for improving the statistical methods used because the better statistical methods and study designs tend to find smaller effect sizes. So when you scale up the studies, you might, this would be of concern. These studies tend to control for various confounding factors. We find that weather, residence type, and demographics are all included in these studies. In the base primary studies, weather seems to definitely be an important control variable. For the others, we don't necessarily find a strong effect, but that could be just because it's harder to capture this in our meta-analysis. Okay, what's going forward? I wanted to actually just introduce this quickly. So at MCC Berlin, we're trying to do like a comprehensive assessment of behavioral change in households and what it means for their energy consumption. So specifically for buildings, we now do want to look at next what happens to energy consumption with building upgrades and weatherization and use of, for example, there is some initial work which suggests that there are potentially significant rebound effects with building renovations. So the overall reductions might be somewhere to the order of not more than 15%, which I find very interesting, given that we have definitely seen assumptions which are definitely higher in the energy models before. And we also would like to understand what actually prompts people to increase renovation rates. Obviously, that's very important to understand. Same for energy efficient appliances, where we want to look at behavioral interventions can increase purchase rates, but also are there actually associated reductions in energy consumptions with these, or does it just lead to rebound effects? So that's the work going forward. Happy to discuss and get ideas on this as well. Otherwise, this is my profile, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tarun, especially adhering to the time and for this amazing presentation. So do you have any more questions? Please raise your hand so that we can come to you from the audience. And from the speaker as well, if you have any question for Tarun, please feel free to. Okay, I do not see any questions. So if you have still any question, feel free to write them in chat. Otherwise, let us go to the last presentation of the session. Carlos, over to you.
Okay, let me share my screen.
We hear you from a very low volume.
And now?
Better. Thanks.
I think that the closer to the mic, it's better. I think.
Yeah.
So can you see my screen right now?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay, so I'm Carlos Quesada. My work is carried out within the framework of the European Research Project Y. And my presentation today is an assessment of regional differences of electrical load profiles. So, by way of introduction, the energy system models are tools that help energy analysts to evaluate the impacts of long-term scenarios, which are quite good on the supply side, but they lack the degree of accuracy required on the demand side, especially for households. Indeed, the behavior is quite irregular from household to household, and the synthetic profiles of traditional energy system models have problems to capture all possible cases. So in this work that I present today, the objectives are the following. First, obtain a set of profiles that define the electrical behavior of households. Second, describe the household personas, that is, the typical households behind each of these profiles. Third, evaluate how these personas are distributed among the regions or countries and study their differences. And finally, and this is still a work in progress, evaluate the short-term and long-term distribution of these personas. So, understanding the composition of electricity demand at the household level will allow us to segment the market. That is, it will be possible to know in advance for which sector a given technology will be most profitable. And in addition, energy analysts and policymakers will be able to better define their interventions to promote energy efficiency, demand response actions, and encourage policies that foster investments towards the energy transition. Therefore, understanding how the household electricity demand is articulated contributes to achieving the climate neutrality goals in the UAE. So, to achieve all these objectives, we have followed the methodology that we summarized in that figure. First, we have a large set of thousands of dwellings, each one generating a load profile. The differences between load profiles are due to a large number of factors, such as the size of the and type of the dwelling, the socioeconomical conditions, consumption habits, and so on. Load profiles are made up of thousands of samples, and they may have different lengths. So it's necessary to find a way to work with them in an efficient way. So feature extraction is a dimensionality reduction technique that computes a set of values from each load profile. These features represent certain characteristics of the load profiles. By reducing the load profiles to a small set of relevant features, further analysis are computationally less complex. In particular, we have computed over 650 different features for each load profile here. And we have selected those features that have provided us with the best results. Finally, to build the set of profiles of electrical behavior, some unsupervised classification techniques, in particular clustering analysis, has been applied to the features. This has led us to obtain 40 different electricity consumption patterns or personas that has been represented for better visualization as heat maps, as you can see here. So the load profiles with which we have worked come from different sources, both public and private. In total, we have gathered 18 datasets with different sizes, formats, and characteristics, and we expect to incorporate some more. The number of load profiles of each dataset is variable, as you can see here. We have prioritized in our preliminary analysis those with the highest number of time series, those in purple here. We have discarded datasets with very short time series or those that only included data on appliances and not complete households, those in red here. Some of the datasets, those in blue here, have very recent data, and we will analyze energy consumption before and during COVID lockdowns, but this is just a future work. And in total, we have used for our analysis nearly 24,000 load profiles from 6 different datasets representing households from 5 different countries. Okay, so to analyze in detail the 40 electricity consumption profiles that we have obtained, we have developed a taxonomy and a decision tree based on the similarity of the electricity consumption behind each profile. Thus, we find 5 well-differentiated groups of consumers. On the one hand, the largest group in orange here contains almost 3/4 of the load profiles analyzed, and is formed by main regular households, let's say. On the other hand, we have a group formed by secondary households, those that are only used during the summer or holidays, which are those in blue here. A group where consumption is more associated with equipment, such as energy storage or electric heating, those here in yellow. A group of offices and small businesses in green here and here. And finally, a tiny group with consumption associated to street lighting, the one in red here. So if we zoom in on the largest group, which is the one of the main houses, we can get a subdivision according to behavior. So we have a large subgroup of households, 30% of the total here, in which behavior changes during weekends, this in green. Then we have households that spend all day at home, which are those in purple here. Households that make more electrical consumption at midday, perhaps because they are using electric kitchens, those in yellow here. And households where we find more pronounced consumptions around all meal times, those in red here. So finally, we come to the analysis by region. For this purpose, for each country, we have represented only those consumption patterns with more than 5% of the load profiles. Each color bar indicates a different pattern and its proportion with respect to the rest of the patterns within each country. So these patterns are depicted just below in the form of heat maps, as you can see here. So our analysis here provides the following highlights. First, 2 clusters are among the most prevalent in all regions except Ireland. These are the patterns numbered 15 in red and 28 in green. These consumption patterns are associated with regular all-day at-home behavior. And the main differences between 15 and 28 are that 15 has less consumption in summer here, and 28 has not changed in summer. So second, the Irish dataset is the one that shows the greatest differences with respect to the rest, although it shares many characteristics with other Anglo-Saxon countries analyzed, which are basically the UK and the United States here. Third, Portugal and the United States share a pattern that clearly dominates the dataset. This is pattern 36 here, the one in pink, which contains small and medium-sized companies or businesses that do not close for holidays and open from 6 a.m. So in particular, the 5 most popular clusters comprise more than 90% of the time series in Portugal and in the US. In the rest is the 60%. So the main general questions of the decision tree that we can ask to identify to which group a particular pattern belongs are summarized here. So they are, do you take meals at home? If so, at which times? Do you use electrical appliances for cooking? Or also, do you spend your weekends at home? Or are you a business or an office? These may be the general questions. So some limitations of this analysis are the following. So first, we lack random sampling. So the results must be taken with care. Second, we lack the data that provides some context. So it's not easy to stratify further and correct for potential biases in order to extrapolate. And finally, it's important to remark that we are analyzing some data sets with small amounts of load profiles, for example, the ones of the Portugal and the United States, of which we really don't know the origin. We don't know what kind of load profiles they are having inside. And finally, the next steps. Those future steps are, for example, including new data sets. We have spotted some from Australia, Austria, Germany, and Finland, to evaluate the differences introduced by the COVID lockdowns, to include new features to improve our clustering, and to build new models to determine patterns from socioeconomic profiles and vice versa. So here I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlos. It's really, really insightful.
Thanks.
So do we have any question for Carlos? Please raise your hand by using Zoom reaction. Okay, I don't see. Okay, I see.
Alessio, I think that's the
Alessio,
question.
yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carlos. Very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Actually, you raised the point I was about to ask in your last slide, but I was curious about different socioeconomics or different household types. What is your plan actually to investigate different
Socioeconomic
profiles
factors.
and yes, how they
Okay, our plan is that each of the data sets that we have been working with contains some metadata that allows us to have this kind of information. Not all the data sets have the same information, but for example, there are some data sets in which directly, for example, in the UK, you can find some acorn classification that is giving a lot of information about the kind of people who is living in one household. In other data sets, for example, in the one of the Ireland, we have some surveys performed to the people living in the house that allows you to know something. In the data from Spain, for example, we have information about the municipalities where they are living, which may allow you to have some information of the quality of life, let's say. And in the other data sets, we have no information at all. So as you see, it's a bit heterogeneous, and we have to deal with it one by one.
Great, thanks, Carlos. Are there any more questions? Great, then let's go to the last round, which is basically discussing some of the big questions as well as some of the key takeaways from this session. So may I request Vasilis to share your screen, please?
Yes, just 1 minute. Okay, so hopefully let's see my screen. Right?
Sure. Thanks. So the idea of this session is actually very simple. That is to try to understand some of the big questions we have, especially for building sector related modeling. And here, this big question necessarily we will not answer to probably every questions, but at least we can, give some certain ideas or points on how to tackle these challenges. So Vasilis, can we go to the first slide, please? So I would like to pick each of the speakers' brain, and I would like to request the audience to post their comments on chat box. First question I would like to ask, that sector coupling. So as we know that now we are moving towards climate neutrality, also one of the key emerging issue we often face during modeling is sector coupling, especially when we talk about building sector. It often we are getting suggestion to couple it with transport sector at the least. But as we know that it is kind of difficult job when it comes to modeling, and especially we need to understand whether the market will be ready to couple transport and building, let's say, for example, let's say by 2030. I would like to pick your brain on that. And is there any volunteer from the speaker group who would like to first share their opinion? Or else I have Alessio in mind, actually, to answer this. So maybe, okay, Alessio, you should start.
Thanks a lot, Suran. Yes, indeed, I think we already had a lot of discussion in this project led by Wright and Yaza. It's called EDITS, and it is, yes, it basically gather a community of modelers, and we discussed already a lot. I think, yes, sector coupling is a very important point. And I can say at Yaza, we started looking into that. And we tried already to make some of these linkages, the one between the IEM message and the sectoral models, such as the buildings or transport model, and then also the link with industry. So we have also colleagues working on materials, and we try also to link information on material demand and scrap release from the building sector, so that it can be assessed also in this industry supply chain model. I think still there is a lot of there is for sure a big gap there, especially when I'm thinking about linking transport and buildings. So one main topic is also urban form. So different urban developments will have consequences both on the building sector and the transport sectors. And I think is a key question how to make the best synergies out of that. So to reduce distances when it comes to transport by having, for instance, a more compact urban form, and at the same time reducing energy demand due, for instance, to this more compact form of buildings. This is just an example, but I think there is still a lot to do there. And while I've seen a combined study, maybe at the urban level or regional level, I think when it comes to the larger scale, there is still a lot to do, and especially the framework to think of how to make this linkage operative.
I agree with you, Alessio, and these are very valid points. As you mentioned that we discuss this often in EDIT project. Here, I just would like to add one more point here, that whenever we talk about sector coupling, we often talk about using IAM models to do so, to model this. And one of the biggest criticism of IAM models is that they do not incorporate many of the technical details when it comes to regional sector, that is what Alessio was also trying to mention. And as a result of which, your demand gets underrepresented in the final system model outcome. And that is why we often face a challenge. And this is why we also should discuss another question to it, which is why energy demand is important, because we can ultimately achieve climate neutrality by replacing everything with renewable energy sources, right? So why do you think that we should model energy demand separately? And this time I should go with the team.
Yes. So if I got your question correctly, you're wondering why we have this separation between those two poles, right? Between the demand and supply. Yeah, that's. I think we're increasingly seeing the problems of this now. Like as some of our results might have shown in my presentation earlier, it's very critical to account for these systemic effects of energy demand changes, and not just to get stuck with policies on or with energy demand in itself. So overall, you also mentioned inclusivity of energy efficiency policy packages. I'm not sure if this is what your question was referring to, Shuran. Sorry.
No, so I wanted to generally pick your mind on what do you think that why we should actually, model energy demand separately, especially when it comes to building sector. Because if we see at the system level, we can actually replace everything with renewable, and then automatically your emission comes down.
Okay, now I get the core of your question. I think it's critical to model energy demand because we've been basically, I don't want to say we've been doing it wrong for 30 years or so, but we didn't really account for the complexity of behavioral aspects, particularly in the household sector. When we look back at energy models for the building sector from 10, 15 years ago, they mostly dealt with this economic paradigm that consumers are rational and that everything we cannot really explain. We explain through the discount rate or so, which doesn't really hold anymore nowadays with newer research. So it's very critical that we expand on this knowledge and that we get a good understanding of what drives behavior in households, like beyond cost and beyond those classic variables that we used to consider. So a lot of work to do, in my opinion.
Can I actually add to that, Shravan?
Please, Tarun.
So, I mean, I also do power system models, and increasingly what I've seen is that at least within Europe, scaling up renewables is great, but you need so much, and also to decarbonize every sector. The fact that you can't actually scale up to the extent that you need renewables. So to say that we can just replace everything with renewables is a bit of a yes, maybe in 100 years' time, but the short term, that's not something that's that's easily said that done. And secondly, also given the huge changes in energy demand, for example, the effect of electrifying heat and putting it from a power system perspective, the imbalances that it creates or the challenges that it creates are serious. And if energy demand management can actually help in that, that's a very, very important contribution.
Thank you, Tarun. That makes absolute sense. And this also relates to, about behavioral modeling, because two of the presentation, we talked about why it is important to model behavioral change. And this is somehow related with demand as well, of course. But what we need to understand precisely, for example, one of our recent publication, which we will publish hopefully by end of this year, there we could see that when it comes to behavioral modeling, many of the models, even the building sector models, they cannot incorporate it because we do not have an input data at an aggregation level. Because in order to model that, you need that input data to incorporate it. And that is, I think, a big challenge, because when we say behavioral, it's an umbrella term. So we need to basically drop down at activity level, and then we can model it. And this could be one of the takeaway from this session as well, because two of the modeling exercise here, they have presented that how to model the behavioral changes as well. And I know, Vasilis, in your model, Dream, you also do that. So maybe if you can share a bit of your experience on how you do that.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, behavioral is an umbrella term, and I mean, we must always define what we mean by that. I mean, for example, in the Dream model, what we do is that we are trying to find and disaggregate data for activity in occupancy and activity levels for each member state. For example, I will talk for the case of Greece, because this is where we have done the most with the model, and the model is a bottom-up. So from my experience, what I've seen is that you have more flexibility in bottom-up structures to work for such features. I mean, because it's what they do. I mean, they build from the bottom, from the building level. Maybe you start with a household, so then you upscale, right? So I mean, it's easier there. So yeah, from my experience, it's difficult to do though, because first you need to define the spectrum of what we call behavioral changes and what we include in this discussion. I mean, because also, by just modeling the activity of occupants is also something that it's under the umbrella of behavioral, modeling the behavior of occupants. And then the other part I would say, to my experience again, is the difficulty to find the data. And maybe, of course, also another one, the third one I would say is also to come up with the right formulas, a way, to make it more, to find the right mathematics behind the behavior. That's another also.
Makes sense, Vasilis. Thank you so much. So can we just directly go to the last slide, just to give us a summary of what are the key points we have discussed? So here are basically the summary of the session, and summary is, as we can see, we need to act fast and we need to act efficiently as well. Here, there are a couple of points we have discussed, couple of points we can combine, and of course, we need many more models actually to complement our work, because clearly we could see that there is a challenge when it comes to standalone building energy demand models. So we should actually fill that gap by adding more models, developing more models, and also upgrading the existing ones. And for that, we also need to understand a model user's perspective as well, which we can understand with this type of conferences by interacting with you, all of you. And so I would like to end this presentation by thanking all of you, both the speakers as well as audience. So yeah, thank you guys. Thank you so much for your participation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suran and Vasilis, for a great session, chairing
Thank
and
you.
organization.
Thanks.
Yeah, take care.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.